We're going to have a panel with Nate Moore and Jeff Bauman and Autumn Durald Okpa for Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. Let's get started. I really wanted to make this about them telling us about the film more than me talking, so I wanted to start with Nate telling us how he got involved with Black Panther. He's done both films and just his journey on this project.
Yeah, thank you guys all for coming. Really appreciate you guys coming out. Interestingly enough, the first time I've seen that scene in a while, so it sort of takes me back to both making the film and seeing it for the first time. You know, when we produced the first Black Panther movie, one of the things that was really interesting was exploring the world of Wakanda, this sort of fantastic Afrofuturistic place that had never been colonized. And the first movie is very much in conversation about colonization and Killmonger's point of view as to what Wakanda could or couldn't have done in the world and how that motivated Killmonger's, revenge. And Ryan often would say, the Black Panther franchise, if it's a franchise, is one of the few stories that can really talk about these issues that have sort of shaped our world, this notion of colonization, people being displaced by other people. And so very early on when we were developing the script for Black Panther Wakanda Forever, it was also, how do we continue that conversation and show Wakanda a version of themselves in the Talokanil and Namor who had to leave, who had to create a new society underwater because of their experience in the world. So it was interesting to see the evolution of the storytelling. Obviously along the way as we were developing that film, we lost Chadwick Boseman, who was both a friend and a collaborator and somebody I was very close to and Ryan was close to. And so the movie then took another life as both a memorial for the guy and the character who I would argue are kind of tied together in a way that felt like we couldn't unwind that. So we wanted to honor the experience we were having of having lost our friend, but again, continue that conversation of how does grief motivate people. And in this case, Shuri's motivated very much by the loss of T'Challa in the same way that Namor is motivated by the loss of his homeland. So we were trying to, I think the degree of the difficulty for this film was relatively high, and at least what we attempted to tackle thematically, you'll have to tell us whether or not we succeeded. But that was part of the joy of making the film, was trying to do those two things at once and hopefully have those two issues hold hands and hopefully also be entertaining and do all the other things.
And apologies, I forgot to say Nate was the producer, Jeff is our VFX producer, and Autumn is the cinematographer. So
VFX supervisor.
VFX supervisor. Super excited to have them here. We just rushed in, so I was like trying to get everybody up to speed. So we could segue into the three of you had an amazing relationship working together on this film. And I'd love to talk to you, Jeff, in terms of how you got involved. Obviously, you've done both films as well, and just tell us your process and your involvement.
So yeah, I was involved in the first film with Nate and Ryan as well. And then when I was approached about joining the second one, and having worked with Ryan and Nate, I couldn't say no, just knowing who they were as two human beings, and knowing that Ryan wanted to tell another story that had the ability to connect to all of us. So I jumped on immediately and wanted to find out how I could become involved, not quite realizing the complexities that Nate had just described, and the massive undertaking that the film would be. And as soon as I was on, then just wanted to try to give my input into how I could help assist in the storytelling, and help kind of bring Ryan's vision to the screen. And then fortunately enough, was introduced to Autumn, who's a huge counterpart for me in that process, the visual language kind of the film, because she kind of sets the table, and then I have to build her trust in order to try to take it through to the end. And that's kind of then where we ended up meeting and kept going from there.
Yeah, so Autumn, tell me, how did you get involved in the project, or tell everybody here how you came to work on Black Panther?
Yeah, I think the first person I talked to was actually Nate. Rachel Morrison is a good friend of mine. She was unable to shoot it. I was actually finishing Loki at the time, and I got a call from Nate and Nate set up a call between Ryan and I, because Rachel was mentioning she had a conflict in her schedule, and Ryan wanted to speak with me. And Nate set up a Zoom between Ryan and I, and after that, I loved speaking with Ryan, and it was a great fit, and of course I wanted to do it. And then Jeff actually reached out to me before I started to just talk to me and, kind of get to know me and figure it out. And I think what's so great is that, Ryan built such an amazing team around him that, everyone gets along and everyone's very talented and supportive, and we all love him. So we're all there to kind of build this kind of world together. So yeah, I love these guys. And from the start, I was always talking to Jeff about the visuals, and he was always supportive of what Ryan and I wanted to do. So what you see on the screen is such a great collaboration of everyone. But as far as the tools and like the lensing and the camera, because we're here for Sony, it was all embraced. And because of these two people, like I had a great like kind of journey as far as like production, pre-pro, and being able to like execute all of this, the world that Nate spoke of earlier on, that was a beast.
Yeah, well, before we move on, just to more story, talking about the story, just tell us a little bit about how you chose to shoot with the Venice and the lenses that you chose, and how that affected the film and the filmmaking and the storytelling and all of the above, I guess, and then we can go down the line.
Yeah, I think Ryan had yet to shoot anamorphic. The first one was shot spherical. Rachel mentioned that he was kind of interested in it. Like, to be honest, like she had said that maybe he was gonna think about it for this one. But it was all driven from story. So I heard about it early on, and it was something that he brought to the table, and it's my favorite format. And so, it was really just showing him stuff early on to say, okay, this is, what we can do, and this is, the camera that I'm interested in, and these are some of the lenses that, from Panavision that we like. And then from there, it's really having the support of VFX, because honestly, from the start, anything that's more simple to work with without heavy aberrations or heavy field curvature or like crazy flares is going to be easier for VFX. But when you have a team that's supporting a director and everyone's there for story, for character, and these choices of having these heavier kind of characteristics and lenses are for, the actual what's on the page, people are going to embrace that. And Jeff and his team were game to kind of, not deter us from using kind of lenses that were going to be a bit trickier for VFX, honestly. So instead, Ryan was full on to kind of use these things, and Jeff being, who he is, we all kind of just said, okay, these are our lenses, and Ryan loves them, and I love them, and so let's do what we can outside of the box to make sure that the VFX is going to support those choices, because it wasn't easy.
And I don't know if people, if everybody is in the business or isn't in the business, but when you do start a project, it's such an important conversation to have, and a lot of people do shy away from anamorphic because it is more of a process for you. And Jeff, I'd love to hear you talk about, because you did come up with an unusual system of mapping and figuring out how to use these lenses and keep the vision that Autumn and Ryan wanted to have on the screen through post, which was pretty fascinating. So,
and that was part of the reason for that first call, was to kind of see where Autumn was leaning, because I think at that point you had just finished Loki, or you were still on Loki, but we were in prep, and I wanted to start putting together what our image workflow and pipeline might be. So knowing what camera she might be using, what her lens choices might be, and then learning that she wanted to go anamorphic, which was fine. I had just done Black Widow as well, which used the Sony Venice. So we'd gone through the anamorphic workflow, but not nearly as in depth with regards to embracing the lenses and their aberrations and characteristics. And I think one piece that Autumn really brought forward was wanting to make sure that the CG actually supported and matched the practical photography. And so that there was, I think we ended up shooting, and thanks to all of the camera assistants on your team that shot the 15 terabytes of lens grids and everything, Christmas lights and everything possible to figure out, astigmatism and 45-degree angles and everything we did to that we were able to, with effects, create a lens toolkit that we then shared across all of the visual effects facilities, which is, I don't think, anything that's really been done in that way before. Normally we shoot grids and everybody kind of has their own process and procedure for mapping the lenses and then adding the aberrations. And often even in companies, it's kind of done to eye by artists without necessarily trying to have it be consistent. And one fear I had was on a film of this scope and with the production schedule we had, consistency was going to be critical to try to make the CG work and play well with the practical photography. So with this toolkit then that we then sent out to the 17 vendors across the world, they were able to look up serial numbers and then add those certain characteristics to that particular lens, so their CG matched the plate photography as close as it could be. And I'm sure there were some cheats probably that were done within that, but at least we were starting off in a much closer place than we'd ever had in the past. And then what was really interesting to see is all of the facilities, we started to have like these global Zoom conferences where we would get style frames from Autumn, and it didn't just become about the lenses, it became about framing, it became about her lighting, the use of negative fill, all of the characteristics that kind of created Autumn's vibe needed to kind of be respected in post. And that just kind of, and there was interest then, and then all of a sudden you'd end up on these Zoom calls and there'd be 50 to 70 artists at these different companies that were all asking questions and were really excited and entertained by the process. And then they had ownership of it. And it wasn't just you were slapping something on. And as you said, it kind of makes it harder, but at the same time now there was a method to it and they were curious about it. And you had ownership, and I think at the end of the day that all kind of, it shows. And then, we kind of continued that relationship with Autumn and brought her into post a lot more than I've with any other DP, as far as getting her eyes on shots earlier, getting her notes on lighting, all CG shots, so that we could give those notes back to the various vendors in order, again, to have it match with what she would have done on the day had it been real. And it was great experience.
Yeah, I'm sure. And Nate, was that unusual for you to have that kind of experience as a producer as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think each one of these shows becomes their own animal, and it is very much defined by the filmmaker. And I think the thing that is special about Ryan Coogler as a filmmaker is that he's a humanist. Like, he appreciates the value that each and every member of his crew brings to the movie, and he doesn't think that value stops when he stops shooting. So, obviously, he had a great relationship with Autumn in prep and production, but a lot of filmmakers might not have taken the same time in post to include their DP, not because they're being malicious. It's just the process moves on, and sometimes the DPs take another job, and it's hard to get people in the same place at the same time. And there are many instances in this film where Ryan said, well, let's show it to Autumn. Early viz, just so that I, Ryan, feel like my DP and I are still rowing in the same direction. The same goes for Hannah Beekler in the production design, Ruth Carter in the costumes, even Drew Petrata in the props. Like, what was the intent of this? Because you are fantastic craftspeople, and I, Ryan, want to take advantage of that because I'm, A, I do care what you think, and B, I'm a smart enough filmmaker to understand that the film will be better. I think one of the things that made this film special was, as Jeff said, people really bought into the vision of what the movie was about, both from a spiritual level of celebrating Chadwick Boseman, but again, of celebrating a new culture that we hadn't gotten to explore in the first movie. And I think the buy-in from the crew from top to bottom, our operators were fantastic, our sound team was fantastic, our video playback was fantastic, because they understood that if we could do this movie correctly, it could be a celebration of Mayan culture in a way that isn't often seen in Western cinema, a sort of revisiting of a place in Wakanda that wants to celebrate the continent of Africa that we don't often see in positive lights in Western cinema. And again, a love letter to a guy that a lot of us worked directly with from the first film. So I can't say enough good things about our crew, because we wouldn't have made it through what I would argue is certainly the most difficult shoot I've ever experienced, with a lot of the emotional tolls that we experienced together, but we were together. and that made it doable.
I love that you mentioned the crew. How many people are here that worked on the film? A lot? You can shout out. We can't see your hands. Woo! Congrats to everybody. It's huge testament. I know. Autumn has told me a lot about the experience, and all of you were so important, and myself being a cinematographer too, it's like we can't make these films without all of you, so thank you. And to segue into that, because I've heard some stories from some people about the water work. I'd love to hear your thoughts. We could start with you, Nate, just reading the script and knowing what that was going to entail, and then we can go down the line again and talk about the visual effects aspect of it and the shooting aspect of it. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, from a production standpoint, when you read the amount of water in this film, my first thought is, well, that's a lot of dry for wet, but I guess we'll do it. And we had a filmmaker who was not interested in that as an approach, right? I think Ryan, again, being a thoughtful filmmaker, wants things to feel tactile, not only because I think that's how he understands it, but he intuitively knows that he'll get better performances from people if they're in the environment they're supposed to be in. So that entailed building, I don't remember how many tanks, and having a lot of the cast and operators and crew in the water early in prep so that people understood what the expectation would be on the day. What is special about Ryan, again, is here's a man who goes, oh, if they're going to be in there, I better be in there. So I kind of need to learn how to swim for this movie. And I will do the breathing exercises with them, and I will get in a bathing suit and change on the deck in front of everyone, and have to not have the ego of what some filmmakers could have had, which is I'll stay at the Village and I'll let you know what I want, but to go in there and be a partner with them so they never felt like, oh, I'm out on this limb by myself. It was, no, we're out on a limb together because we're going to try to make this thing as good as possible. And I think that fidelity to how water moves in a movie that does have this much water turned out to be certainly more important than I thought it would be, but I think Ryan always knew that from the beginning.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, so tell us what your experience was like with obviously there was the wet and the dry, and yeah.
So initially I was honestly extremely overwhelmed with how to achieve it, knowing the reality of production, the reality of shooting, and not just that aspect, but then also the other aspect of how much do we all truly know of what it is like to be underwater and what happens to imagery and cameras and lenses underwater. How is color absorbed? How is light absorbed? And how are we able to establish dialogue so that we all can be speaking the same language when I'm trying to get notes back from all of the creatives. So that was one of the initial things for me, was just a deep dive into water myself to understand the science behind water, light in water, color in water, and then try to boil that down into terms that I could try to relate to everyone else, so that then we could all have common dialogue with regards to which colors are absorbed and why are they absorbed, and that was kind of the beginning of it. And then the next step for me was trying to get production early on to get us all in the water, so we could figure out how to shoot, try to make sure Autumn had time to try to light in water, just to start learning, because it's such a long, difficult and arduous process just to test something. So that was the beginning steps, and then what we realized with Ryan's support, and that I should say that was the most important thing, is having a filmmaker that wanted to shoot in water. Had we not had that support, the whole thing would have been dry for wet, and I think we would have had a much more difficult time putting our finger on the reality of things. So, and I think we all knew that we would be able to shoot some things wet for wet, and some things would have to be dry for wet. There's an aspect of performance in storytelling where the feasibility and feedback loop between the talent and the director just aren't realistic in order to get the performances. And the same I would say for Autumn, from that standpoint of her ability to communicate with operators, gaffer, grip, etc. You just aren't going to be as efficient with the actual character storytelling parts underwater as you can in a dry for wet scenario. So one of the approach we kind of took early on was to try to shoot as much as we could underwater, wet for wet, to have the performers understand what water was like, to see how their bodies moved underwater, to really experience it. And then for the heavier performance scenes, we would then replicate those in a dry for wet scenario, but everyone had already been in the water. We'd seen what the imagery looked like in water. The actors knew how to move, and I think that kind of muscle memory really helped the dry for wet work be different than had it just been dry for wet out of the box and had no one really actually made the attempt to be in water. And so that then in post, while we were working on some of the dry for wet scenes, we were intercutting from wet for wet work into dry for wet work. We could always kind of check ourselves with something that was real. And I think that kind of comes back to the lenses as well of, it's a huge CG movie, but at the same time, we wanted it to be grounded in reality in some way. And the only way for that to happen was to really commit to wet for wet work. And I think then having, Nate and the rest of production support us in that and find the balance, because there's the reality as well. We need a certain number of days. There's a schedule that we need to keep. And as Nate said, it was a challenging shoot to begin with. Take away the water aspect from it. It all worked out in the end, and I think we all learned a tremendous amount.
Can you explain just really quickly for people who don't understand how you merge the two, the dry for wet and wet for wet, just so they understand how that works in the post process? Obviously, Autumn can chime in on that too, but.
Sure. So in the early days, one of the kind of first proof of concept tests that we did was once the tanks were up, was we picked a scene and we basically shot a scene in the tank in a wet underwater, and then a few days later we shot exactly the same scene next to it on stage in a dry for wet scenario. And then Weta, who was doing the work for us for those particular sequences, we asked them to match the dry for wet work to the wet for wet. Just, and didn't add any environments or anything, but just make the two look the same. And just to prove that was achievable and you wouldn't be able to pick the difference. And we were able to do that. And then that kind of basically set the bar for, okay, how do we now move forward into the next phase, was determining which scenes we were going to try to split the two worlds. One of probably the most noticeable ones is Namor's his temple, which is the big kind of his throne, his big megalodon throne that he sits on, where we shot the whole scene in a wet for wet scenario underwater. And then few months or few weeks later, we ended up shooting it on a stage with basically a red backdrop. So it wasn't a complete set because we knew we were going to have to replace it. However, I felt it was important to have the correct color, shape, and lighting. So there was no relief. It was a flat, essentially, in a circle. But what it did allow, and everything was spatially correct. So Autumn could light it. We could get the right bounce off of the flats. Operators could frame up. Everything was where it should be, and it matched scale-wise the same space that we had shot underwater. And Ryan was actually really happy with what we had shot, wet for wet, to the point where I think he almost at one point was like, "Why are we reshooting this?" And I think, both Nate and I were like, "No, we need to shoot the performance. You need to do it dry for wet as well." And that was essentially how we did it. And then he had the option of kind of going with the wet for wet version or the dry version.
Well, and the upside too of reshooting that scene specifically was Hannah had developed this whole hieroglyphic story of what was behind his throne. And her concern, which is a valid concern, is oftentimes if you don't have that in camera, digital artists aren't going to have the same fidelity to that story because they're going to go, oh, it would be cool if this one was upside down and this one looked like this. So again, part of it was the desire to really get the culture specificity correct. And by building that backdrop and letting Autumn and the operators frame up on the actual story, that story, if you could take the time to watch the movie and piece it together, is actually a coherent story from beginning to end. And that's only because, again, Hannah very smartly took the time to build it for us so that the VFX vendors also would know where everything was meant to go.
And then Autumn, so when you started on this project, I'm sure you had never done anything like this before because no one had. So what was that like in terms of just the R&D and preparing to start shooting this?
Well, I was just going to comment on what Jeff was talking about, the underwater. I think one of the first conversations that's important to talk about is the lighting of underwater, because we all have a reference of seeing films that are underwater and people are talking, which we're not used to, right? Because we all swim maybe in a pool or in the ocean. But when people start having dialogue and they have clothes on and they're living underwater, like we've seen references where it's very bright and it looks fake. So one of the first conversations we're having is like, lighting is so important underwater, like it should feel real. And that comes from Ryan. Ryan wants it to look real. He doesn't want it to look fake. It should feel grounded. It should have texture. So, with that kind of agenda, we all approached it as like, how can we make that happen on a very highly VFX film with, obviously you can't shoot every single element underwater, but you want to try to. So put as much as you can underwater, give costumes the opportunity to put costumes in there, see how they move, see how light looks, see color rendition of sets and costumes, so everyone can kind of chime in on, what things are doing. And I think Jeff was very important in like keeping that through line of the lighting of the water underwater versus on the dry for wet consistent. So we lit everything underwater the same as we did dry for wet, which I think is very important. So contrast ratios, faces, textures, everything that had darkness underwater, we replicated that on a set. And you'd find that, when you're doing things, in both environments, you have blue screens, you have the spill from the blue screen, which can light your fill site up, and it can do a lot of things that you're not, that aren't appreciative. But with Jeff, he would allow me to turn the blue screens off. We'd roll a frame or two with the right contrast ratio. Then we would give both to Weta, so they had a kind of grounded, reference to like what things looked like in the perfect scenario, like how dense or dark did Ryan want it, because Ryan wanted it very like this like deep sea kind of movie, or sorry, deep space movie underwater. And he wanted things to go dark because that's what happens, like light doesn't fall very far in the depths and you can't see everything. And when you start to see everything too far underwater, it feels unreal. So I think is very important in, having VFX, consistently do that when you're giving them these plates. They're not bringing them up, they're not brightening the shadows, they're not changing the contrast ratios, they're keeping what you achieved on set, which is what the director wanted, and they're following that through the whole workflow. So I think that's why I feel that a lot of the underwater is very successful, is because it has a mood and a tone that, was talked about early on and supported.
And did you find a lot of that language while you were shooting, or did you figure it all out before? I'm just curious, because it's kind of, it's unusual, and the way that you shot this and the way that you finished it, it's different than anything we've seen. So I was just curious how much you guys discovered on the shoot itself.
Yeah, I mean, we were supported in prep to kind of throw everything underwater, like as far as like Nate supporting that agenda, Ryan and VFX asking our line producer to give us the time to, make space for that, which I think is important as a DP. Everyone's talking about how to make that happen with all of your crew. But I think as far as VFX, I mean, there's a taste level when you're looking at things underwater, and that was protected in prep. So, if you light something well in a natural environment, you do want to see that same vibe underwater. Like it should still feel like a real space and contrast on a face. So Jeff was very, he talked about that early on about, light it the way that you want underwater, and let's see how that looks, and let's like make sure that we do that in prep so that we can give Weta everything. Because I think we did all these early calls with Weta to try and figure out what it should look like. And honestly, if like there's a VFX reel that comes out, like it looks pretty close to the early renders of what we put together. That was very beautiful, and Ryan was very happy with it.
I mean, and it was a journey to get there as well, because we knew it could turn into Vegas very quickly with bright colors and things that we didn't want it to be. We wanted it to be, real. And interestingly enough as well, one of the colors of that throne room being red is the color that's absorbed the quickest in first, and you lose that color very quickly. And it was something that for a while, even once we were in post, sometimes we were pushing the red a little further. And I remember at one point when Ryan was like, "No, we should dial back. We need to stay true to how red is absorbed," which was great because there is that question at a certain point where we could go off and then have everything be too vibrant and have the colors live for too long. And it was a journey, but we ended up staying true.
And Nate, were there things that you weren't prepared for in terms of as a producer?
Yes. I
Yeah.
mean, for sure, certainly. We did all these camera tests. Clothes would fall apart in the water, and Ruth would have to go back to the beginning. Sets would be put in the water and dissolve, and Hannah would have to go back to the beginning. Like there was a trial and error process that even as we were shooting, because you don't know what you don't know, right? And I think collectively we have a good deal of experience, but not a ton of experience in water. And so that was the great unknown for all of us. What prop will hold up, or do we need to have a half prop because we need to extend it because that's never going to hold up? Like we learned as we went, but everyone understood the assignment, so to speak, and said, okay, well, look, there's going to be some times when a department's going to take an L today, but we need to get the footage, and we're going to do the best we can. And we know that on the backside, Jeff and the team are going to have our backs and visually maintain what the intent was, even if that costume currently is unshootable. So it was a process. You're always discovering things. You're discovering the lengths which your cast can and can't be pushed, even from a performance standpoint. And again, as sort of a very humanist director, Ryan was very sensitive to not putting people in positions where they felt uncomfortable for too long, which we've all heard stories of directors not being that thoughtful. But it was about adjusting to the element and not trying to control an element that, frankly, we couldn't control if we wanted to.
So the big question is, what's next? Now that you've done
Well, no, look.
land, water,
Yeah.
fire.
Oh boy, this movie is truly a labor of love, and I know that's a very trite things to say, but it was for all the reasons you can think about. So to truly consider what is next, I think we'll take a beat, to be quite honest. I think at least we are more in love with these characters and these worlds that we've been able to bring to audiences after this film than when we started. So I'll be surprised if you don't see one or all of these people again. As to when that is, I don't know. But we're just so glad to share this movie with the world, and so glad that audiences seem to be responding to it.
That's great. Is there anything else that you would like to say, Jeff or Autumn, just before we wrap up?
My crew's here, and they did a great job. So,
Could you guys stand up, whoever worked on the film? Stand up. We want to see you. Yay! Mic tap. So anyway, thank you, Sony. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This was wonderful to hear the filmmakers' thoughts and what it was like to work on this film. And hopefully we will all be here for Black Panther 3 soon. Thank you.
Thank you.